When I was 19 years old in 1996, I read The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden, this book, and it rocked my world. It just blew my mind. If you had asked me as a young man, what's the single most impactful book you've ever read? It would be The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. Now, almost 30 years later, having run a private practice, seeing clients professionally for the last 28 years, and having had a lot of time, not just to study all of Dr. Branden's books and teachings, but to troubleshoot it and test it with clients and in my own life, I feel that it's about time to make a video about the work of Nathaniel Branden, his approach to psychotherapy, and his teachings about self esteem in particular. I'm going to be discussing what I think are the strengths and the weaknesses of his framework and his teachings, right? So when Nathaniel Branden was 24 years old in 1954, he was a psychology student in New York, and he was running a small psychotherapy practice by the side. And he had this little epiphany. And this epiphany was that the common denominator in people's issues or problems seemed to be a kind of fundamental experience of themselves as deficient in some way, as not worthy or not enough, a problem with self-esteem. And as he wrote, he could think of no single factor that was more influential, across the range of, who might you resonate with in a romantic relationship, or what do you aspire to in life? What do you put up with? What do you think is possible for you? Do you resonate with people who treat you well and respect you, or people who treat you in abusive ways? Do you get addicted to substances? How do you deal with your own, thoughts and feelings? Are you willing to acknowledge mistakes? Can you say sorry? Uh, these sorts of things, right? And Brandon went on to write books that have been read by millions of people. In 1969, his book called The Psychology of Self-Esteem became a bestseller. Probably the most popular book is The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem, the one I just mentioned. He also wrote books on Ayn Rand, for example, The Vision of Ayn Rand, which was his latest book in 2009, and also about romantic love. His book, The Psychology of Romantic Love, is actually a really, really good and interesting read. So, is he right? Is self-esteem the kind of common denominator when it comes to human suffering? And is trying to raise people's self-esteem the way to go to live a more fulfilling life and to help people who struggle? By the way, Brandon was a long-term student and collaborator of Ayn Rand for about 18 years, and highly impacted by her philosophy, and that also contributed probably to him reaching that conclusion about self-esteem. So according to Brandon, self-esteem essentially had two components. One had to do with what you could call self-efficacy or confidence, and the other had more to do with call it self-appreciation. So the first one being uh, confidence in your ability to think and to cope with the challenges of life, to learn and to adapt. That would be the more confidence aspect of it. And the second one would be a kind of disposition to experience yourself as appropriate to life, as a person who deserves to be loved and respected, and where it's natural to express your wants and needs and values, essentially. So he would conceptualize the combination of those two to be the basis for self-esteem. His definition of self was a little bit muddy. He wrote different things. He would say that the self had, thinking components and affective components, and it was the capacity to think, and also that it kind of was confidence itself. So I think one little mistake he made there, which is exactly what the spiritual teachings are trying to wake us up to, is that he would conflate thinking and the contents of thinking with being, right? So I want you to keep that in mind a little bit, just as we proceed. Now, he would conceptualize self-esteem as there being six pillars. So the first one would be to live consciously. And you could call that essentially to think for yourself, to be curious, to have a healthy respect for facts and evidence and reason, wanting to know, caring about what's true. How does this actually work? What's really going on? The willingness to examine your beliefs and your assumptions and to correct mistakes. And it would be the opposite of living mechanically and unconsciously, as a sheeple, just essentially going along for the ride and not really questioning things. So living consciously would be one. And another pillar would be self-acceptance, refusing to be in an adversarial relationship with yourself. So your capacity to own and kind of hold both your heroic aspects, so to speak, to not disown those, and your more mundane aspects, but also the negative thoughts and feelings of your own psyche, your capacity to hold them and to accept them, and not let them define the totality of who you are. That's an important one. Another one was self-assertiveness, the disposition to live a life on your terms, to honestly express what you want, how you see the world, to express your sexuality, your passion, your whatever lives inside of you, as opposed to a life where just other people or the tribe or the group gets to define your life, and where all those things are kind of suppressed or adapted to fit in. Living purposefully, which would be the opposite of just essentially drifting or being run by short-term hedonism and sensory pleasure, but to instead do your best to live a meaningful life with work and hobbies that are engaging, and also, of course, significant relationships. The willingness to choose your own values and your own goals, and to live in accordance with that. And finally, the practice of personal integrity. And this is essentially, walking the walk. Are you honest? Are you living what you preach? Is there an alignment between the values that you claim to hold and how you actually behave and show up in the world? So here's what I would say as the most positive aspects of Branden's teachings. I spent a year working with the long-term unemployed as a consultant. So I would spend 2 days a week with them, both doing individual work and also doing these lectures. This was back in the year 2000 until 2021, And these people, many of them struggled a lot psychologically. And one thing I noticed was that they were doing the exact opposite of what Nathaniel Branden suggested, for the most part. So in speaking with them, you would see people who would live kind of mechanically and unconsciously, and often not really be curious, not really having a quest for truth, or respect for facts and evidence, but people who would more often just live in denial and not want to really look at things or address things. They would often have a low level of self-acceptance, a lot of issues with substance abuse and trying to run from their own inner life instead of accepting it and owning it. They would live a life that often was revolved around just hedonism and satisfying short-term needs and using other people as objects to kind of get what they want. A more Machiavellian, opportunistic, uh, parasitic type lifestyle. Not a life of principle and consciously chosen values with a healthy respect for other people's right to do the same. Um, and where integrity was low, meaning to lie and to cheat and to live as a parasite and to kind of engage in victimhood and to blame other people and circumstances for one's lot in life. The opposite of the personal responsibility that Branden would preach. Not only with these folks, but in terms of seeing clients over the years, I see that so many people, who struggle a lot psychologically are heavily invested in victimhood, heavily invested often in ideologies and ways of thinking that points the finger outwards and essentially says, you make me feel. You're responsible for giving me what I want. I'm entitled to this and I'm entitled to that. Again, the opposite of the kind of self-reliance and self-responsibility that Nathaniel Branden would encourage people to practice. You also see a way of conceptualizing self-interest where people very often spend their life trying to control other people, trying to dominate other people. Uh, in a very competitive, comparative type of way. So many people practice what William Glasser used to call external control psychology, which is this idea that you are kind of the source of my feelings, and I can make you happy. I can be the source of your feelings. So if I'm supposed to feel better, you have to change. So they spend their time in relationships, criticizing, complaining, nagging, threatening, manipulating to get their partner to change, right? So a lot of people engage in trying to control other people. Or they spend their life as doormats, as people pleasers, where they spend their time trying to get other people's approval, getting validation for the most part. If only I can be perfect, if only I can live up to what my peer group or significant other or friends, expect of me, then they will approve of me and then I will feel good. A lot of people, most people, I would say, operate there. Branden had a very different way of uh, talking about, self-expression. It was not about controlling or dominating or being better than other people or sacrificing yourself on, to other people, but it was about, living a life on your own terms, a self that takes joy in its own being, where you express what lies within you, and you appreciate other people's right to do the same, and you try to build a meaningful life and to have healthy relationships with people based upon mutual respect and cooperation. So a very different orientation. And I'll tell you this, when I read Branden's book at age 19, I grew up in Norway. I live in Norway. The rhetoric in Norway is very much one of collectivism and altruism. You're supposed to, being a good person essentially means to sacrifice yourself to the interests of society and others, right? So a kind of altruistic, collectivistic mindset where altruism is good and self-interest is kind of bad. The conceptualization of self-interest that I was indoctrinated into, in public school and Norwegian society at large, was that, well, self-interest, that's egocentric. It's about greed. It's about exploiting other people, for your own, benefit. Entrepreneurs, people who made money and who did stuff, were kind of looked looked upon as they've kind of taken advantage of other people. And most of the teachers in Norwegian public school and the intellectuals are quite left-leaning into collectivist views, right? Um, Now, I would often, in my teenage years, also spot the hypocrisy of that, because so much of the altruism, of the putting other people first, was people who would essentially live as people pleasers. So again, if I can only be perfect and be the way other people want me to be, then I will get love and approval. So ultimately, it was about looking out for number one, only in a kind of indirect way. Now, this isn't a black and white thing. I'm not saying that none of these people were ever motivated through compassion or kindness or wanting the best for other people. Sure. I'm also saying that there's also very often another aspect of this, which is kind of self-serving in a indirect way, in a kind of virtue signaling type of way, right? Now, also, I've always done martial arts. This is my 40th year in the martial arts. So in the 90s, when I was a teenager, if you in Norway practice, let's say, karate or taekwondo or jiu-jitsu or something like that, you would, the culture is you only train with people within your own style for the most part, and the organization that you belong to, and you would do as you were told. It's kind of, this is what the master says to do, with very little emphasis on asking questions or individuality for the most part. And when people would compete, they would compete with other people who belong to the same organization and the same lineage. Contrast this with the United States, where people like Bruce Lee, and his Jeet Kune Do at the time had been more influential, where it was more about, well, train different styles, but you take what works for you. You adapt things and you make it work for you. Where people from different styles could come together under the same roof and compete, you know, using the same rules. That type of mindset was way more appealing to me. I found myself kind of alienated from Norwegian culture. I was more of an individualist at heart. I didn't like the collectivist culture. So when I read the Six Pillars of Self-Esteem, I read it after reading an interview by the martial arts legend Joe Louis, who was a former kickboxing champion who had been a psychotherapy client of Nathaniel Branden's, and who was really hailing that book, the Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. So that's how I got introduced to it. Now, when I read that book, it was like drinking a glass of cold water on like a really hot day. Like it spoke to my soul for lack of a better word. I felt that Branden was uh, putting words to or describing what I was thinking and feeling, but just with more depth and more sophistication, right? In a way that I couldn't do myself. So I think what Branden has done for millions of people with his teachings and books is to provide a positive version of self-interest, which is not based upon short-term egocentrism or belonging to a group and kind of sacrificing yourself to the group, nor narcissism, not based upon dominating and controlling and being better than others or sacrificing for others, but on your life belonging to you, and that you have the responsibility and the right to choose your own values and to do your best to create a meaningful life and pursue your goals based upon your values, and to allow other people the freedom to do the same. I think this is a way healthier psychology. It's also very different than narcissism. You know, people conflate self-esteem and narcissism. Now, if you look away from Branden and you look at, modern researchers, you can read about this in the book Transcend, for example, by Scott Barry Kaufman, where he talks about modern research on self-esteem. And what they seem to be landing on is self-esteem, being composed of mastery and self-worth. Very similar to what Branden was writing about, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and 2000s. The mastery aspect, again, being your ability to think and to figure things out and to adapt and admit to mistakes and so on. And worth being, your experience of kind of being appropriate to life, just like Branden did. And that this is not the same as narcissism. It's not that when people have too much self-esteem, they become narcissistic. It's kind of the opposite. So narcissism is more about a kind of addiction to feeling special. It's an addiction to feeling special. It comes with grandiosity and arrogance and a sense of entitlement, and very often a inclination to exploit others, and to not really see them as people with their own inner lives, independent upon from our own psychology. All right. So so both self-esteem and narcissism tends to kind of come online at around age 7, and they move in different trajectories, meaning that people's self-esteem, as defined by modern researchers and Branden, seems to be at its lowest during the teenage years. And then for most people, it kind of increases as they mature and develop psychologically. Whereas for narcissism, it's the opposite. It tends to be at the peak in the teenage years with that egocentrism. And then for most people, it tends to kind of decline. So this is very positive stuff. And I'll also say this. When I look at people who tend to have their shit together, who seem to be resilient, who seem to live meaningful lives, who seems to have good quality relationships that are not based upon abuse or exploitation, but on mutual admiration and support and respect. When you look at people who have good boundaries, people who have good emotional regulation, they tend to practice the exact pillars that Branden presented. They tend to live consciously. They tend to emphasize honesty and integrity, and they tend to consciously choose their own values and try to live according to them, and they do healthy self-expression, right? So anything that kind of, and they tend to take responsibility for their own life and for their own inner experience, and to do less of the kind of blame game. Um, Branden was also really a champion of romantic love. Again, that book, The Psychology of Romantic Love, which his first edition was 1980 and the second one is 2008. It's a crackling good book. And it kind of shows how in more tribal societies and kind of collectivist societies, romantic love, that deep, intimate connection between two individuals who really admire and value each other and have a special bond, that's, looked down upon and disencouraged. What often more gets encouraged is like fleeting sexual encounters and promiscuity and short-term flings and stuff like that. But Brandon also really wrote that like that romantic love is for grown-ups. It's not for kids. It's for people who have a healthy sense of self. That you have to say the I before you can say love you. And I think he's largely onto something there. And also that people who have good self-esteem tend to resonate with other people who have good self-esteem. And people on the more low self-esteem side seem to resonate with people who, a bit like intelligence, people who have relatively good intelligence seems to resonate with other people who do, and people who kind of are on the lower end tend to hang out with people who might be pretty dull in that sense. I also do think that um, I lost my train of thought there. Oh yeah, here it is. If you look at most people's thinking, most of it is kind of self-referential, and most of our issues revolve around our own self-concepts and our own identities. So, as one spiritual teacher used to say, why are you so unhappy? Because all of your thoughts revolve around yourself, and there isn't one. Another quote, Robert Keegan, the developmental psychologist, he said something to the effect of, in any job, people are doing a second job that no one's paying them to do, of covering their weaknesses and vulnerabilities and enhancing and protecting a particular self-image, and that this second job gets in the way of that first job that people are actually paid to do. So people's self-deficiency stories, who they think they are, what they think they deserve, uh, working at the level of helping people to either change those stories or to see that they're thoughts and not who they are, like see their illusory nature, is extremely useful. Also, if you look at what's called spontaneous remissions in the medical literature, when people survive diseases when they were supposed to die, if you read the books of people who work with this, and you also speak to people who do radical remission work, you'll hear that one of the typical things that happen is that people have a shift in identity right before the remission, a fundamental change in how they see themselves and their relationship to the world. Not implying, of course, that everyone who has such an awakening has a remission. That's not the case. Just pointing out that quite often when people have these remissions, there seems to be a profound shift in identity beforehand. So, some criticisms and some what I've kind of discovered throughout the years, right, in working with this. So, I think that the six pillars, instead of saying that they're the six pillars of self-esteem, which is a construct that I think is more inaccurate and unhelpful than not, I think that what Branden proposes there is kind of six pillars to a good life. Like if you can practice personal integrity, honesty and formulating your own values and asserting yourself in a healthy way and taking responsibility for your own experience and practicing self-acceptance. That is that lays the foundation for a life where you live a meaningful life and where you can form healthy adult relationships, right? It inspires healthy boundaries. It inspires better emotional regulation. It inspires better capacity to take perspective on things and to discover your own blind spots and to correct your mistakes, to have more compassionate for other people and their suffering. So these practices are great practices for living a good life and for cultivating so many of the psychological skills that are important in not only living a good life, but living a life with less unnecessary suffering. Now over to some of the critique, right? So when Branden is asked to define a self, and this is kind of tricky territory, right? Um, his definition is kind of vague. He writes about the self being that it has cognitive and affective components and tendencies of personality, also the capacity to think, but also, consciousness itself. So I would say that he's kind of failing to make a distinction between being, just the very fact of consciousness or being itself, and thinking. And this is a mistake that's made, all the time in Western psychology. And this is one of the things that people like Eckhart Tolle and other spiritual teachers tend to help people move towards. When people have a so-called awakening experience or awakening insight or realization, it very often revolves around having a felt, embodied, if you will, appreciation of the distinction between thinking, the contents of consciousness, and being, subjectivity, aliveness itself, right? So, and what it also teaches us is that we're not the thoughts and the feelings and the personality tendencies. And if you look at the values and the goals, these are the contents of consciousness. It's basically thinking, and most of our psychological suffering is the result of consciousness or being itself seeming to be fused with the content of thinking moment by moment. Thinking without really seeing thoughts as thoughts, which makes it seem that our very being is fused with the content of thinking moment by moment. So, um, oh, here's the interesting thing, too. Of course, talking about self-esteem, it's a bit like talking about Santa Claus when you talk about the self. There really is no self. There's no entity like self. There's no thinker behind the thoughts, or chooser behind the choices, or seer behind what's seen. This is an illusion, and you can directly look into your own experience and look for indirect experience, a self, and there's no such thing to be found, right? Now, Branden believes in a self, so he's obviously not seen that the self is an illusion. Now, of course, almost all of us have a sense of self, but that sense of self does not point to. It seems to point to an entity of sorts, but it's not actually there. So how could you esteem something which isn't actually there? So this identification with thinking, uh, really creates most of our psychological suffering. And of course, this notion that I am the thinker of the thoughts, and therefore they say something in particular about me. So, in my life, this many years later, I've clearly seen that there is no self. There is no Jurgen in there, so to speak. There's no self to esteem in that sense. Now, having said that, though, very clearly there is a selfing process, self-referential thinking going on, and seemingly this character who evolves over time and is separate from the world. Um and when people develop psychologically, they tend to move towards creating this psychological autonomous core self, or at least the illusion of it, which is distinct from the world and seems to be stable over time. Now, this might be, in the words of Noam Chomsky, a necessary illusion to develop the exact psychological qualities of healthy boundaries and perspective taking and cognitive flexibility that I alluded to earlier. We might need to develop this illusion to develop these very relevant psychological skills and capacities. Uh, you know, so the irony is, but before you kind of begin to look too deeply into the self being an illusion, you probably want to really spend some time building up that illusion. And Branden's teachings is a great way to do so. I remember a while back I read a book called Finding Awakening by Dr. Christiane Michelberger. Who's a physician and a psychoanalyst, who's written this book about how she found awakening. And she writes about these meditators who had raised their kids to not use the word I, or to kind of negate, because they thought that, if they just never, if they don't, develop that illusion, they won't suffer psychologically. But the opposite was true. It really, really screwed the kids up. So from the point being this, for most people, it's going to look as if they are the thought content, their personality tendencies, this character that the mind seems to create. And there is going to be a reputation you have with yourself then, meaning you're going to esteem this character as you. And it's an illusion, but it might very well be a necessary illusion of sorts. Now, Albert Ellis has criticized Branden a lot and said that, self-esteem is a sickness or a myth. It can't be both at the same time, but where he kind of mischaracterizes Branden's work a little bit by saying that, self-esteem is basically global self-rating, right? That okay, if I succeed and reach my goals, or the goals society say I should reach, then I kind of create this idea that I'm a winner, or I'm good, or I'm worthy, or if people love me and appreciate me and validate me, that means I'm good. So it's this tendency to rate ourselves instead of rating our behaviors. Whereas Branden would say that no, it's not about rating ourselves. It's a natural consequence that if you act like a thief or a parasite, or don't take responsibility, it's not about, the problem isn't that you rate yourself as having low self-esteem. The problem is that your self-esteem will be bad. Right. So Branden, here's something else too that's interesting. Branden always talked about how self-esteem had to be reality-based. And it's so interesting because he's one of the most misunderstood psychologists out there. because he's credited for being kind of the father of the self-esteem movement. But what the self-esteem movement turned to was, platitudes and affirmations, and every kid gets a trophy, and this sort of stuff. But that's as far away from Branden as you could get. He would say no, self-esteem has to be based upon genuine, integrity and personal responsibility and genuine accomplishment and living your values, and that sort of stuff. And it has to be reality based. So let's look at the pillars then, and kind of strengths and weaknesses here in Branden's work. So let's take, of course, one weakness of the objectivists is that they had too much faith in their ability to kind of see reality as it is, right? This idea that I can use my senses and my mind to kind of grasp objective reality. They tend to fail to see the subjectivity behind that. But I think you can still be reality based. So I'll give an example of this. I studied with a guy in Canada called Tony Blower. He was an excellent self-defense instructor. I used to teach self-defense myself for 16 years. And what he would do, which he taught me when I trained with him, is to create something called panic attacks or simulations, where you would give people protective gear, plexiglass helmets, stuff like that. Gear that was light enough that if someone pushed your kidney into a doorknob, you wouldn't get injured, but it would still hurt, right? And we would create these simulations with roles and dialogues and sucker punches, and where people would have of course it's fake, but people would respond as if it's real. People would have the adrenaline dumps and the tunnel vision and the hyperventilation and the loss of, fine motor skills. So this is an example of like reality-based training. Now, is a panic attack or a simulation real? No, it's fake. But it's as real as you can get, and it kind of creates many of the same effects that people undergo in real life confrontations. So I used to do seminars with this and put my students through this, and I would have so many black belts from various martial arts who would come in and do these panic attack simulations. And for most of them, all their skills went out the window. They didn't use their martial art. They would revert back to haymakers and shitty tackles and stuff like that. And for most of them, it was humiliating and embarrassing, right? Most of those people went back to their dojo and their training as if nothing had ever happened. Some people opened their eyes and they had respect for the evidence and the reality of it, and they would adjust their training. So I think that's a good analogy for what Branden meant by living consciously. And here's an interesting thing to look at too. So Branden's saying that your self-esteem has to be reality based, right? But then look at a guy like the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, who's the author of the book The Case Against Reality. Now, he makes the claim that we can't be in touch with reality. It would be way too overwhelming, that our brain and mind, if you will, is designed to kind of filter out reality and to give us a kind of species adaptive simulation that's useful in navigating life. So he uses the analogy of your keyboard, on your computer, where you might have a Skype icon or a trash can icon, where he says, look, those icons are useful to help you navigate the internet, like the terrain. And if you take a document and you put it in the trash can and you press, it has real consequences. But the icon that you see of the trash can looks nothing like the reality, the processes that makes the icon of the document disappear. It actually hides that, right? and in my own case, doing all the meditation and all the work to discover that the self itself is an illusion, we got there by having respect for evidence and facts and being willing to troubleshoot and course correct and caring about what seems to be approximately true or not. So both Branden and a person like Donald Hoffman, who have very different epistemologies and relationships to whether they think they experience reality or not, got to where they got to by living consciously. So that's something to contemplate. Now, Branden really emphasizes what he calls sentence completion work, where he gives people these stems. So, for example, if I were 5% more conscious about my eating habits, and then you have to find, grammatically correct endings to the sentence, 6 to 10, he would emphasize that type of work to facilitate insight and for people to get new perspectives and stuff like that. I've found some use in that. Here's the weakness. I think the weakness of Branden's teachings is that he does not do a good job in differentiating what you could call reflection from rumination. So if you look at more modern research from metacognitive therapy into, for example, depression, you'll see that the main driver or hallmark very often of depression is rumination. It's a problem of overthinking, just the volume of thinking being way too much, and people trying to think their way out of thoughts, right? And the same with anxiety, that worry. It's another overthinking problem. So one thing I've seen with people who adopt these teachings is that some of them can easily go into depressive states and anxious states by ruminating, by becoming, by investing too much in their thinking and taking it way too seriously. Another little criticism is that, and Albert Ellis makes this quite often, where Branden talks about these things often as needs, like you have to do this, and you have to be conscious, and you have to practice personal responsibility. And this tendency to masturbate also has a tendency to create more psychological disturbance. So he would have been better off if he made a distinction between musts and needs and merely preferences. That the fact that it's a good idea to do it doesn't mean that you have to, right? And also I would say also that he emphasizes cognition too much. Like in terms of living consciously, it's so much about thinking and figuring things out logically and using reason. Whereas, and I'm not knocking that, but if you look at, for example, the practices of meditation and mindfulness and inquiry, there's a lot you can discover about subjectivity and experience through these sorts of investigating direct experience modalities, which are not based upon concepts and reasoning so much. And also to explore consciousness itself. What is the nature of being itself? You can't do that through logic and thinking. You have to do it through direct investigation. So that's a little criticism, And you see more modern forms of psychotherapy, like acceptance and commitment therapy and metacognitive therapy, which are popular today. These orient more towards changing your relationship to thinking and feeling and loosening that process of identification. Looking at self-assertiveness. I mean, if there's one thing that very often kills relationships and passion and a zest for life, it's that tendency to kind of suppress one's own experience. So learning to assert oneself in a healthy way is awesome. And if you look at people who struggle with autoimmune disorders, um, you will see that quite often they have a tendency to do too much self-sacrifice, to put enormous pressure on themselves to be saintly and to be good people. And they develop, chronic pain and these sorts of autoimmune responses. Uh, so learning to express yourself in a healthy way to assert yourself can really make a difference when it comes to health. When it comes to personal integrity, Milton Erickson used to say, uh, neurosis is the inability to speak directly. You'll see that so many of people's symptoms are a result of not being able to directly state things or directly, do things. Um, so living a life of more integrity, of more honesty, of more direct communication can really lower stress levels and even improve what we refer to as our physical health. Also, finally, here, consider the work of James Penbaker, who used to have people do this exercise where they would take something that really bothered them, a secret, something they hadn't come to terms to, and he would have them write about it for 4 days in a row, 15 to 20 minutes, down on paper. Just write down their deepest thoughts and feelings. And for most people, this had quite dramatic improvements, both in psychological and physical health. And the conclusion was that, secrets are bad for us, or disowning our experience is bad for us. So I think Branden's philosophy really helps in that regard. Finally, when it comes to integrity, I think one trap with integrity is that sometimes we can kind of confuse integrity with ideology, where it becomes about being fused with, well, a set of values or a set of principles and premises, and kind of mistaking that for the totality of experience and the totality of who we are. And in that sense, we kind of lose integrity with the greater whole. Uh, I mentioned previously Robert Keegan, the developmental psychologist. When he talks about the self-authoring mind in several of his books, he quotes Nathaniel Branden's writings as kind of being a great expression of what a self-authoring mind looks like. And I think Nathaniel Branden's teachings are great to help people to develop more of that self-authoring mind. I think if you look at Branden's writings from a ego development perspective, the teachings of Jane Lovinger and Susan Cook-Reuter, uh, at least the 6 pillars of self-esteem, it's really conceptualized from that kind of strategist stage, or autonomous self, which is about self-fulfillment and self-direction and kind of trying to become the most one can be. And even the ability to begin to own your own shadow. I'll end by saying this. I read Branden before I read Ayn Rand. And many people kind of accuse Branden of being a knockoff of Rand. But I prefer Branden's writings. I think they're more sophisticated. I think they're more psychologically astute. Uh, he's better at, uh, seeing some of the subjectivity behind the alleged objectivity. There's more of a respect for emotions and more of an emphasis on self acceptance and not disowning your inner emotional life. And there seems to be more of a capacity to own one's own shadow elements. You see this in Ayn Rand's characters, in books. Conflict is external with the other person. It's never about seeing, in yourself what you attribute to the other person. Whereas Branden's teachings seem to more encourage people to own their own shadow material, for lack of a better word. And interestingly, Branden has been vilified by many for being a person who perhaps did not live up to his own premises and standards. Many call him arrogant and conceited, and he's definitely done some stuff in his life which isn't that praiseworthy. But I would say to his defense, if you look at his autobiography, My Years with Ayn Rand, he's brutally honest with himself. There's a remarkable ability to be honest about one's own shortcomings and to own them. And it's kind of a story of redemption. So it's interesting to read a biography where the author of the book often kind of presents himself as the villain in at least quite a few aspects of the book. I hope this was useful. I'd love to hear your comments, what you've gotten out of Branden's teachings, to what extent you may agree or disagree with my analysis. Know that I see clients from all over the world, so if you want to change something and you're curious to see if you and I could be a good fit, I invite you to shoot me an email at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2025, know that I'm doing a masterclass on how to work with clients who depress. Starts on March the 12th, one day a week, one evening a week, 5 weeks in a row. If you're curious about that, go to the seminar page. You'll see a link. You can find the information. As always, thanks for listening.